We have a terrific lineup. One of the flagship programs, achievements of this government has been the delivery of essential services, what I call the new welfareism, the public provision of essential private goods and services. And of course, the architecture for that has relied on JAM, Jan Dhan Aadhaar Mobile. And of course, that trinity has been deeply researched by this trinity, which is, Karthik, Sandip, and Paul, who've done, enormous amounts of work. So without further ado, let me pass the floor on to, I believe, Sandip, you're going to be representing, right?
Yes.
And Sandip, ground rules very clear, 30 to 35 minutes, because we have a hard stop at the other end, as Podam said. I will let you know exactly about 15 minutes, give you one warning and maybe 2 minutes before the kind of final warning, and then we go on to the discussion. So I'm not going to introduce all of you. You're all very well known. We want to listen to the authors and the discussants. So over to you, Sandip.
Great. Thank you so much, Arvind, for that very nice introduction. I am Sandip Sukhtankar, and I'm going to be talking about work that, as Arvind mentioned, I've done with Paul Niehaus and Karthik Muralidharan. Karthik, you all know and should be here. Paul Niehaus is our partner in crime for many, many years. And so let me just start sharing. Can everybody see that? Yeah, Arvind, I can see. Great, perfect. So this is representing work from over a decade. So this is work that we started in 2010 when we first approached the Unique ID Authority of India to ask about the Aadhaar rollout and whether we could work with them on evaluation. And at that point, they said, look, we're still in the process of figuring it out. Why don't you go to Andhra Pradesh, where they already have a system? And so that's what we did, and we worked with them on evaluating smart cards. And since then, we've done various pieces of work examining the A in the JAM trilogy that I think Arvind coined, which is Aadhaar. So let me start. Let me give you. I hope Karthik is going to join and be able to answer questions in the chat. If not, I can answer them later on. So let me start with a bit of a global perspective.
Sorry, I'm here. I'm here. My computer crashed, and so I had to dial in from my phone. But I'm here.
Okay, great, excellent. So let me start with a little bit of a global perspective, since most of the audience, I assume, is from India and might not quite realize how big of a deal this has become across the world. So the World Bank has an ID4D initiative, that's ID for development, and they estimate that 1 billion people worldwide do not have any sort of official proof of identity. And that includes 40% of people in low-income countries, which is unfortunate, since the United Nations has set this target, part of the Sustainable Development Goals, to provide legal identity for all. And the idea is that legal identity will help people get transfers, welfare programs from the government, allow them to access legal help, the legal system, as well as access the banking system, finance, economic opportunities, set up businesses overall. And so again, maybe this is not something that is well known, but 161 countries, according to ID4D, have some sort of digital ID system, whether it's a foundational ID or a more sort of specific scheme. And this includes, of course, biometric IDs. Now, of course, these ID systems don't have to be digital or biometric. In the US, we have a little paper social security card. But the advantage of digital or biometric is it helps get around illiteracy. It helps us get around constraints of numeracy. You don't have to remember passwords. You don't have to remember numbers, for example. Of course, Aadhaar has been at the forefront of this revolution, and I don't have to tell you much about that, since it's, as we will point out shortly, it's ubiquitous and everybody knows about this. But nearly 1.3 billion Aadhaar cards have been issued. An interesting piece of a nugget of information from the State of Aadhaar reports is that they estimate that this is the first ID for 8% of people that have it. Of course, it's used in different government schemes, even for private sector services, which has been a bit controversial. And the Supreme Court was asked to rule on the constitutionality and the legality of the requirement of Aadhaar. And in 2018, it basically decided that the requirement of Aadhaar was allowed in paraphrased terms, and transfers from and to government. So if the government is giving you money or the government is receiving money from you, it can mandate the use of Aadhaar. It explicitly prohibited private firms from requiring Aadhaar for accessing benefits. You can still use it, but it can't be required. But of course, this verdict did not stop any of the controversy. The use is still really controversial, and the controversy rages around these two basic sets of ideas. The proponents claim that the use of Aadhaar in making transfers from government is going to lead to a lot of fiscal savings because it's going to reduce leakage. So if I'm transferring money to Karthik, I can be sure that Karthik actually gets it, and it doesn't leak out, and there's not multiple Karthiks, etc. Meanwhile, critics claim that requiring its use is going to exclude people who don't have it, people who have it but suffer from authentication failures, and that can cause significant harm, particularly if the transfer is to the most vulnerable and it is something that's really, really essential. So what are we going to do quickly? So in the paper, we sort of lay out a little bit more of a structured way to think about these potential costs and benefits. And then we also spent a little bit of time documenting more systematically, especially since the 2018 judgment, how Aadhaar is being used. But I'm not going to spend too much time on that. Most of the time I hope to spend on reviewing what little evidence there is. And it's just, you'll see these figures. It's staggering how little evidence there is on Aadhaar. On sort of, we're going to focus on four main items. I'll say this again when we get to that point. But leakage, exclusion errors, transactions, costs, and perceptions. And we're going to look at both high quality descriptive evidence that is basically not necessarily causal, as well as causal evaluations, including two of our own studies. And then we're going to end with this approach, some sort of policy recommendations, some may be easier said than done, of course, but this approach to thinking about how you can obtain the benefits of Aadhaar while minimizing the risk of harm. And this is sort of based on our own work as well as the review of the evidence that we're going to see. So let me start with a framework, and this is very, very simple. Again, what we're gonna do is restrict ourselves to this transfer problem. Okay, so the idea is the government wants to transfer some value. It can be cash, it can be kind, like food or fertilizer, let's say, to some select beneficiaries, to chosen beneficiaries, but it's doing this through an intermediary. And this describes, as you'll see in just a few minutes, a majority of the cases that Aadhaar is being used for in India. So to do this successfully, especially because the government doesn't know that this value that it's sent out is actually getting to the beneficiary that it wants to receive it, right? So to do this successfully, the government must first test eligibility right? So if you, for example, whether you're a BPL card holder or not, whether you're a farmer that is eligible for this fertilizer subsidy, let's say, so you have to test eligibility. Then you have to test the identity, so that which is basically authenticate, to make sure that the person who's receiving the transfer is the person that is actually the eligible beneficiary. And then finally, this is sometimes perhaps not as well appreciated. Your government technically also needs to authorize this transfer, right? So in some cases, this can be real time. It's at the point of determining eligibility. You're giving out the transfer. Let's say you're giving out medicines for getting COVID, and you tested someone for COVID. They're COVID positive. You give them medicines. This is straightforward. The authorization maybe is real time. The identity, eligibility are not as relevant. But sometimes this transfer can be authorized with advances or lags. So you pass out the grains for PDS in advance, and then you reconcile how much grain has been transferred to the beneficiary later on. Okay, so I think what is really key is understanding the role of Aadhaar in this process. And so basically, there's a little bit more in the paper, but to understand the framework, we really need to understand what Aadhaar can and cannot do. So assuming that you cannot fake live fingerprints, Aadhaar can confirm that the claimant, whoever is coming to claim the benefits, is real and not a ghost beneficiary. So that's sort of the first role. That's really straightforward. And the second is that it can provide link between these two interactions, right? So it can confirm that the claimant, whoever's showing up to obtain PDS grain, is someone who the government has previously deemed eligible to receive this grain. Okay? It can also confirm transactions sort of across time, right? So you can confirm that the same person is not claiming benefits twice, or across space. So this is going to be important when we talk a little bit later about the idea of portability. So it's not that the same person is not claiming a benefit if it's eligible to be claimed, let's say, in Andhra Pradesh as well as Jharkhand. Okay, so that's what Aadhaar can do, but it's also important to recognize what it cannot do to sort of avoid to contest the sort of unthinking claims that, oh, Aadhaar is just automatically going to fix all our problems. So it cannot, by itself, per se, it cannot improve the eligibility test itself, right? So, for example, if you're determining eligibility for if you're BPL or not on the basis of a survey, Aadhaar is not going to be any use for that. Now, it can be useful if, for example, you can use it to cross-check across different databases. Let's say that benefits for this particular scheme cannot go to government employees, and you have a list of government employees and their Aadhaar numbers. Then, for example, it can be very useful even in this first step. But by itself and per se, it's not going to improve your existing test of eligibility. The second thing that it cannot do by itself, and again, this is really, really important, is remember this transfer, this value is being transferred to beneficiaries from the government through this intermediary. And there's no way of actually checking whether this intermediary, even after the authentication of the beneficiary is done, even after the beneficiary herself authenticates that transaction, there's no way of confirming whether the intermediary is not extracting some of that benefit, right? The beneficiary could just say, hey, to get this, you need to pay me 100 rupees, or hey, I know you're eligible for 20 kilos, but here's 15, take it or leave it. What are we going to do? So Aadhaar cannot help directly with these sorts of issues. Okay, so now that we are clear what it can or cannot do, how do we figure out how to balance the benefits and the costs? Well, we need to think about at least 3 questions. So first is knowing the structure of the program, knowing the mechanics of the program. Do we know that there are major issues that Aadhaar can solve? So remember, ghosts are generally simple to get rid of using Aadhaar. So we might want to know, are ghosts important, right? So are there a lot of ghost beneficiaries? You might also want to know, is the specific identity important? So is it important that Karthik is the exact person that gets this benefit, or Karthik is one of a class of people, let's say students, or let's say COVID patients? It doesn't matter that it's exactly one person who gets it or not, okay? You might also consider whether the benefits are rival. So for example, a coaching class where, I mean, to some extent it's rival, but to some extent it doesn't matter that an additional person attends a coaching class versus not, especially compared to, let's say, the PDS, where if Karthik gets the grain, then I don't get the grain. So that's a straightforward rival thing. And then again, there's things that we can discuss, but it's possible that for non-rival benefits, maybe it's not as important, right? In all of these cases, to figure out whether these issues exist in advance, you kind of need this data, the matched data between what government is sending out and, let's say, what beneficiaries are receiving, in order to measure how big leakage or fraud are and what types of leakage and fraud there are at the start. So that's question 1. Second is, of course, how big are the likely risks of exclusion and transactions costs? Again, you can ex ante, you can tell a little bit, right? So you can tell how likely they are based on the population served. So for example, if it's a really elderly population, you might imagine that fewer of them are going to have Aadhaar. Maybe fewer of them are going to be able to come to authenticate. You can also determine how harmful the risks of exclusion are. So if it's a very, very necessary transfer, let's say food, then you might imagine the risks of exclusion are higher as opposed to other types of transfers. There's, for example, technical training, etc. For small and medium enterprises. You might not imagine that these are kind of life and death issues. And then, assuming that there are these risks, to what extent can the risk be mitigated? And this is something that we'll come back to again and again. Here, can you avoid these risks of exclusion by coming up with fallback mechanisms, other ways of doing of fulfilling the role that Aadhaar is at least attempting to fulfill the role that Aadhaar is supposed to be playing. And here, for example, offline fallback mechanisms can be very important. Okay, so quickly, I want to tell you a little bit about what we found when we looked at Aadhaar use cases today. So there's the State of Aadhaar report 2016-2017 that was incredibly useful. At that point, laid out a huge number of schemes and how it was being used. But of course, since then, there's the 2018 verdict. So we thought it would be useful to update it and see what has happened to Aadhaar usage. And again, as most of you in India will know, Aadhaar usage is ubiquitous, right? So that's what we found. By usage, we mean the seeding or linking to beneficiary roles, either authentication for getting transactions or for receiving DBT transfers. It can also be used, of course, for just proving identity at the airport. Those sorts of things we're not really considering here. You see this in all states, in over 20 ministries. The number and how we define use cases is interesting, but not really that important and not that relevant. But there's a large number. Billions of people have used it. Many for rations. Many have linked it to the bank account. And the interesting thing that we've realized that there's been more new cases, at least we can't say with certainty whether since the Supreme Court verdict or not, but at least since 2017, So Aadhaar usage has sort of expanded rather than shrunk. So most of these use cases involve the sort of example that we set out at the beginning, which is authenticating in order to receive a material benefit. And here it's clear that there's both the potential for reducing leakage, but also the potential for exclusion.
Sandip, you have 15 minutes left, please. Yeah.
Great. Okay, so I'll skip the rest of this bit, but I want to know that in terms of these huge, these majority of use cases, what we need to be sure of to what extent leakage can be reduced versus there might be exclusion, you really need this matched data. And you'll probably get sick of me saying matched data by the end of this, but it's really important. Okay, so this is great because I think pretty good on time. I'm going to spend a good chunk of time on the evidence on Aadhaar. This is hopefully something that you take away from this talk is just the fact that given how important Aadhaar is, given how ubiquitous it is, there's just this absolutely staggering lack of research. Okay, so do it yourself. Put these terms into Google Scholar, and you realize there's up to 15 times more research on NREGA, for example, than on Aadhaar. And NREGA is important. We've done work on it ourselves, a lot of it, but it's incredible that the ratio is so out of whack. And despite trying really hard, we found only 8 studies that are based on primary representative data. And of those 8 studies, only 3 are sort of explicitly causal in that they try and attribute some impact on outcomes to Aadhaar using modern methods of causal inference. Okay, now why is this so staggeringly understudied? Well, it's probably likely due to the fact that there's very little variation as compared to NREGA, which was rolled out across these 3 stages, which provided some comparison group and multiple ways, whether or at statistical techniques, difference and differences, regression, discontinuity, to try and examine if it had an impact or not on every possible outcome under the sun. There's very little variation that you can exploit. And then the second reason is that there's really limited primary data. So you have to go out and collect it, especially, we'll come back to this, the fact that NSS data has not been available, whereas NSS data was in the previous era was available for NREGA, not just available, there were some specific questions in the NSS on employment on government schemes or not, which was really helpful in that research. Okay, so that's that sort of lack of research. We're going to describe what we have. I mean, what it is, what exists is quite good and helpful. And again, we'll focus on these 4 outcomes: exclusion, transactions, costs, perceptions, and leakage. So what we see across studies is that there's small but real exclusion errors, at least descriptively. So these are often self-reported. The counterfactual is hard, but there's no way denying that they exist. And you can look at different ranges. 2% is modal, but it goes up to 7%, 6.5. The thing to recognize is these small percentage numbers are reflecting millions of people. Okay, so there's lots of people in PDS, etc. The interesting part is where people have examined this. For example, the State of Aadhaar report, people report that there's the non-Aadhaar reasons for exclusion seem more important than the Aadhaar-based reasons. And also these offline fallback mechanisms are important for reducing exclusion. The thing that you seem to be able to reliably attribute to Aadhaar is some increase in transactions costs. So for example, your card doesn't work, so you have to go again to get your PDS ration. So this type of transactions costs is commonly documented. given this, you might expect that lots and lots of people really don't like Aadhaar. And in places where there's high exclusion, that's definitely true. So you see, for example, in a study done by Jean Drez et al. In Jharkhand, there's lots of strong feelings against Aadhaar. But if you look at the sort of broadest surveys, the State of Aadhaar report, huge numbers of people seem to approve of the mandatory use of Aadhaar, mostly because they believe it reduced fraud. And then interestingly, even those that are excluded, 2/3 of them seem to be still satisfied with Aadhaar. So again, maybe it's people are used to this, are used to being excluded. They feel that this is going to help them make sure that other people aren't stealing, and so they still think that it's okay. Now, in terms of what is important from the government perspective, leakage, there's very little. I mean, there's basically nothing. And the problem is, again, here, because you need this matched data. So, for example, the DBT website claimed $6 billion in savings from removing duplicates, but you don't know that until you know whether that money was previously going to ghosts or fake people, or actually was real people who are now just excluded because they can't authenticate. So the Jean Drez study in Jharkhand reported basically no difference in access in this PDS purchase to entitlement ratio, which would suggest no difference in leakage, so no impact on leakage. But again, that's only one side of the ledger. There's no administrative data from the other side to know how much was actually sent out, and in order to be able to calculate leakage precisely. So what we're going to turn to next is some efforts at causal identification. So actually looking at the impact of Aadhaar and across various social sector schemes. So the first paper we look at is by Prabhat Barnwal. So these are only the three papers that we mentioned. One is by Prabhat, the other is by the three of us. And so here, Prabhat is a very clever study. So what he looks at is Aadhaar-based DBT for LPG cylinders. Okay, and so this was rolled out across districts in multiple phases, and then it was abruptly stopped. So what he shows is that the rollout leads to a drop in sales of LPG to households, which is then reversed once the reform is stopped. And you might say, oh, maybe that's all exclusion. It's just people who can't no longer access it. But what he actually very cleverly shows is that the black market prices of LPG go down after the rollout is stopped, as well as purchases go down. So basically, that suggests that this is due to diversion of LPG, which resumes after the rollout is ended, which suggests that when there was Aadhaar-based DBT, there was less leakage. Okay, and he shows through all sorts of different things that it suggests that there was leakage, and so there's compelling evidence of leakage reduction, but you can't rule out that at least some of this was due to exclusion. So what Karthik and Paul and I do, is look at two RCT. It is use two RCTs to look at the impact of biometric authentication in two of the largest social welfare programs in India. So we were working with the government and we helped them randomize the rollout of these interventions in two large states. At that time, it was unified Andhra Pradesh and then Jharkhand. And again, we use these matched administrative data with independent and representative survey records. Okay, so quickly, what we did is basically looked at the use of these biometric smart cards to deliver payments on Narega in Andhra Pradesh, okay, in 2010 to 2012. This is a very large-scale experiment. This was done in 157 mandals in Andhra, in 8 districts with a population of 19 million. Then in Jharkhand, this was the use of Aadhaar-based biometric authentication for delivering PDS benefits, again, with a very large-scale study across 10 districts with a population of 26 million. There's a little bit of a time lag. There's a little bit of there's difference in technology and, of course, the programs. We'll get to the differences and similarities in a little bit. Okay, so again, the idea is that in Andhra, you use these biometric smart cards to get your payments on NREGA. You have to authenticate yourself using a smart card. Okay, so what happened? And this was, again, a randomized experiment, so you can easily compare what happened in the treatment mandals to what happened in the control mandals. So what we find is basically great things across the board in this case. So more money went to beneficiaries, more people accessed NREGA. There was no change in value, so there were no fiscal savings to the government, but leakage dropped because people got more money, intermediaries got less. The government didn't change anything, so more money ended up in the hands of beneficiaries. And it also reduced the transactions cost because of various things that the government did to provide this at the point of people's villages. Okay, so
Sandip, I think you have 3, generously 4 more minutes. If you could start to wind down, please.
Okay, perfect, great. And so that's what we see in Andhra. In Jharkhand, when you look at just biometric authentication on its own, basically we saw no change in what made it to beneficiaries, no, but an increase in transactions costs and an increase in exclusion. When the government started reconciling balances, sending out grain to dealers based only on these authenticated transaction records, that point you started seeing a reduction in leakage, but also huge increases in exclusion and transactions costs. And because of this, there were sort of massive protests, and basically the government had to stop this program. So what do you think, what were the big differences? Why was it so positive in one case, not as positive in the other? There were sort of many potential differences. Lots of people thought that differences in state capacity, the fact that Andhra is much better governed in general would matter, as well as the fact that in Andhra it was offline versus Aadhaar, ABBA, it was online, that would matter. But those things didn't really matter at all. So basically, it was actually faster implemented. The offline versus online in Jharkhand didn't really matter. So what are sort of our big takeaways from this? In terms of substantive takeaways, we see that, especially in Jharkhand, after reconciliation, as well as in smart cards, both cases leakage went down. But in Andhra, the benefits were passed on to the beneficiaries. In Jharkhand, the government tried to sort of squeeze rents, which didn't quite work, and so beneficiaries suffered. Okay. So overall, the substantive takeaway is that technology alone is not going to determine these outcomes. These protocols around the use and the design details are what matter. Now, there's also some methodological takeaways. Again, this without the match data in Andhra, where there were no fiscal savings, you could have thought, actually, there's no change in leakage. In fact, there was a big reduction in leakage. In Jharkhand, there was a huge reduction in disbursals. You might have thought, oh, that's huge reductions in leakage, which was somewhat true, but a lot of it was coming from increases in exclusion as well. The other big methodological takeaway is the representativeness of the data, because in AP, even though things were overwhelmingly positive, people always brought up these sort of negative cases because they were vested interests who were losing the ability to steal. In Jharkhand, on the other hand, where there was a lot of genuine exclusion, the government just thought that these are ideological activists who were exaggerating these exclusion rates, and so perhaps did not pay as much attention as they should. So that's it for me. Hopefully I'm not going to go too far over time, but I want to spend just a couple of minutes on sort of our thoughts and recommendations based on this research. The first is pretty straightforward. Building in sort of offline fallback options to prevent exclusion seems warranted. You might be leaving some rents on the table, but it seems like that is really, really important. You can get a lot of the benefits without a huge amount of the costs. But of course, this is not always going to work. So you need some way to get real-time measurement of beneficiary experiences. And so we did this in Telangana using phone calls, outbound phone calls to beneficiaries at a large scale. And that is what type of solution that can be really, really effective for the government to be able to know the ground truth of what is going on. Knowing a little bit more about the ground truth and more research is really going to help if you can incorporate questions about Aadhaar in representative household surveys like the NSS. And releasing the NSS and releasing data itself can perhaps help build trust between the government and civil society, which is really lacking right now. So the government could release the data, could do things like at least accept that there's possibilities of leakage in order to sort of build this trust and get a better sense of what is going on the ground. And then finally, if you think about Aadhaar as a way to sort of improve the beneficiary experience rather than just for achieving fiscal savings, that is, I think, going to get you a lot of the way. So for example, allowing portability of benefits across states, maybe this can reduce some of the frictions, the local frictions that we heard about in the macro context yesterday. Okay, so that's it for me. Questions, comments?
Sandip, thanks very much. Almost on time. Terrific presentation. Thanks to you, Karthik and Paul. I want to turn over immediately to Stuti, but before I do so, I just want to say that it would be remiss in a session at the IPF on Aadhaar to not mention the fact that the author of Aadhaar is the former chairman of the board of NCAER. So Nandan, I think his name is worth mentioning as the man who kind of created this architecture under the second UPA government. So having noted that kind of historical fact, let's move on to Stuti Khemani of the World Bank. Stuti, you have 12, 13, 14 minutes for your presentation. Yeah. Please go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me to this discussion. It's a pleasure to be here, especially because I've been a big fan of the work that Karthik, Sandip, and Paul have been doing. Learn a lot from it and constantly use it in my own work at the bank. Let me just share my screen. Is my screen visible? Okay.
Can you do it on presentation mode, please?
Yes, yes, I've clicked that. Sometimes there's okay, here we go. All right. So I think, Arvind, you and I are of the same mind here. So my first slide, in fact, has a quote from Nandan Nilekani. I'd like to structure my comments around some questions about this remarkable achievement of the Indian state to provide almost all of its people with a digital ID. And my first puzzle with the paper was that it was extremely narrowly framed, I thought, given how huge is the potential of Aadhaar. And in Mr. Nilekani's own words, the potential of Aadhaar goes well beyond welfare schemes. It is having an ID can put, and especially taking a person from not having any ID to having one, can open up an array of opportunities to engage in economic transactions. And so for a policy piece, such as in an IPF volume, I would urge and suggest that the authors reconsider the frame they are taking and broaden it. It also appears a bit outdated in the context of newer welfare policy ideas that are coming up with universal basic incomes and transfers, for which having the technology of Aadhaar can be useful. And I'm going to mention that again in a moment. The second big question around Aadhaar are the dangers of Aadhaar. So the paper mentions the Supreme Court debate over this, but curiously does not mention at all one of the key points that was opinion of Justice Chandrachud in the 2018 Supreme Court decision, which is issues of privacy and freedom of citizens from surveillance by the state. And again, given that it's a policy piece, I would urge the authors to frame it a little more broadly and at least mention it. And my suggestion would be to perhaps mention it in the context of state capacity and the role of trust, which they raise very cursorily at the end and could spend a little bit more time on. I suspect the other discussant on this panel will have a lot more to say on this. It's not my area of expertise, other than just to point out that I found it conspicuous in its absence. The example that was particularly instructive, I thought, in the paper, both from the author's own new research and as well as the descriptive work they reviewed on how Aadhaar was used in the food distribution system in Jharkhand, from the results of which I won't repeat because Sandip just presented it, but 3 out of their 5 conclusions or policy recommendations seem to come directly from their findings in their own RCT study of the PDS in Jharkhand when it began to use Aadhaar, as well as the descriptive work, which is that welfare programs need to be considered from the perspective of the intended beneficiaries. Here, my suggestion is that the authors could do a public service in this policy piece by being a little more self-critical about how researchers engage with policymakers. Because when I read the design of what was the policy experiment that they were evaluating, in this case, it seemed so logical to expect the types of problems they found. Presumably, some of that descriptive work was already there. And I think that a culture where when researchers engage with policymakers, instead of just engaging as, can you randomize it so that we can cleanly evaluate impact, there should be a little more discussion on the design of policy. Research, like most other things in life, has unlimited needs. There are unlimited research questions one could study, and resources are limited. So I'm not sure I think it would be, in fact, a separate, useful, interesting discussion. What is the market test for what are the most important research questions into which to allocate scarce resources? I think, some more using of available descriptive studies, using the logic of theory to design policies before we jump into evaluating them, could be something that this paper would do a useful service by making a case for. Now, the overall question, which the paper kind of avoids because it is so focused on everything is empirical. Unless you have an empirical test, you cannot distinguish between a good and a bad design. I would like to push a little bit against that. Again, taking this metaphor of, in that case, research needs are unlimited. But since resources are limited, using a little bit of the logic of theory could be helpful. I felt as though the paper could be broader and delve into some of the literature, like Kaushik Pasu's 2011 EPW paper, where he makes a case in a very prescient way, using economic theory, that the entire PDS system could be dramatically changed and substituted with a food coupon distribution to households. Kaushik gets even more specific, giving the food coupon to the woman of the household, more specifically. And I feel like this paper can do much more on how having the technology of Aadhaar might dramatically change the design of public policies, and do it with a lens of fairness and justice, not just redistribution, but this kind of lens of what is a fair and just society for the good of all. That's the kind of bigger debate that a technology like Aadhaar opens up. And again, I feel like a policy paper shouldn't be so narrowly framed when it is on a topic which is much larger and has much larger implications. Now, on this issue of Aadhaar and state capacity, of course, the author's premier paper in the AER had the title, Building State Capacity. I would suggest that the achievement of Aadhaar, among many other things, such as running elections or organizing the Kumbh Mela, that the Indian state does really amazingly well, in fact shows that the Indian state has remarkably high capacity. It has remarkably high capacity in the bricks and mortar, technical, getting things done, the hard infrastructure. What the Indian state lacks, and I've made this argument in several pieces of work, are the political incentives among the top leadership.
Had your call?
And the professional norms within the rank and file bureaucracy.
One second. Rakesh, can you mute yourself, please? Can everyone mute their speakers, please? Thank you.
Yeah, very nice. Enjoy.
To effectively pursue what an economist would call public good policies. And this, again, I'm not going to have time today, of course, and it's not my place to get into these things, but these are the types of questions that I think Aadhaar raises. What are public good policies? How can Aadhaar be used for fairness and justice, and wise and restrained state, the privacy issues? These are all questions of state capacity. They've come to the fore, and apparently they have a elite lineage all the way back to Adam Smith as fundamental and axiomatic in economic assumptions of what is needed for healthy economic systems. So I find that the author's fifth conclusion on trust is taking on a very big issue, which has become very fashionable now in development circles, and doing it way too lightly. So I'm going to take this opportunity to share what we are doing at the World Bank's research division on this very quickly. So we published a policy research report on public sector institutions, where we examine it as a series of interdependent principal-agent relationships using microeconomic theory on problems where a higher tier agent, the principal, delegates tasks to a variety of lower tier agents to act on their behalf for their objectives. And I think this framework is a useful way to think about what is the role of trust in the state. Now, we did a survey using this framework in Bihar. There's a website, people can go and look at it. It's very rich data. We love feedback on it. So let me just share two tidbits of what we found about lack of trust within the Indian bureaucracy. So there was one statement which the interviewer presented to respondents and asked the degree to which they agree or disagree with it. The statement was, irrespective of my efforts, the system will not allow people's health outcomes to improve. And this statement was presented to public sector health workers. All the way from the bottom bar is the community health worker, to the A&M who mans the sub-center at the village level, up to the A&M at the primary health center, staff nurse, doctors, and the various supervisors of public health workers in the cadre. And what we found is remarkably high rates of responses, which suggest that regardless of their position in the system, people don't, within the bureaucracy, do not trust the system to work.
Sorry, we're having a glitch, folks. So let me pass on this floor now to what I'm sure we're going to get a very good, legal perspective on this from Arghya Sengupta of the Vidhi Legal Foundation. Arghya, floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Arvind, and it's a real pleasure to be here. And I'll start with a caveat and declare a conflict that I assisted the UIDAI in drafting the Aadhaar Act in 2016 and subsequently defending various facets of it in the Supreme Court. So I thought it would be best that I declare it straight up. First of all, I'm obviously, as a lawyer, going to come at this paper orthogonally. And I think perhaps I have a slight disagreement with what Suthi was saying just before this, is that I found the paper to be a breath of fresh air in discussing the matters relating to Aadhaar as per its original terms. And it was originally meant to empower citizens in delivering services and benefits better by providing an identity to them. And I think the paper kind of takes us back to what Aadhaar was intended to do, to the issues that matter. So two prefatory points, and I think in the public discourse, particularly on Aadhaar in India, people talk past each other. On the one hand, you hear that it causes exclusions, and on the other, it makes savings. And as the paper has shown very convincingly, as in Jharkhand, that it can do both. Something can cause exclusions as well as ensure savings. And so it's important to narrow down the disagreements with data, as the paper has tried to do. And I think that's a great achievement, which brings out very clearly that causing exclusions on the one hand and making savings on the other is a false binary, and we perhaps don't need to see it like that. The second prefatory point, and perhaps the paper does this unwittingly, as I was saying a bit earlier, but it puts the focus back on Aadhaar's original mission on empowering citizens rather than this cul-de-sac on privacy issues that has taken up a lot of public attention in the last few years. This is not to say that privacy is not important. On the contrary, privacy is extremely important. But given that the matter has been settled by the Supreme Court, I suspect that one of the reasons it refuses to die out is because lawyers like myself perhaps are not the most comfortable with public finance issues of savings and exclusions, but are more comfortable with issues around rights. And so the privacy tends to become front and center of the public discourse. And so I'm very happy that the paper talks to the issues on delivery of Aadhaar. And now, having worked with the UIDAI on and off for the last now 7 or 8 years, my point of departure on this paper is the very significant finding. And Arvind, should I continue? Because I could easily stop and let Stuti finish and then go on, because I've just made a couple of prefatory points. You're on mute.
Yeah, I know. I think now that instead of going back and forth, why don't you finish, Arghya?
Okay.
And then I think we allow Stuti to come back and present her findings on the whole trust issue. Yeah, we'll give Stuti 3 minutes at the end after this. Yeah.
Sure. Thanks very much. So my point of departure, as I was saying, is the very significant finding that Sandip was saying right at the end, that Aadhaar should focus on citizen centricity than on fiscal savings. And I think that's a useful point of departure, and I want to unpack that in 3 ways, and perhaps some of this could be usefully part of the paper as well. The first is that over time, it seems that Aadhaar is becoming, or perhaps ought to become, a single sign-on for government-resident interaction. So let me give you an example of where citizen centricity is being thought of as a live case, but cannot be implemented owing to some legal and design issues. So the Supreme Court, in the wake of the migrants crisis during the pandemic, called up the Ministry of Labor and Employment saying that why don't we have a database on migrant workers in this country, and or directed that there should be a national database on unorganized workers to be set up. No such centralized database exists today. Now, the Ministry of Labor has two options. First is to do a fresh data collection exercise, which is both onerous and time consuming for citizens, or it can get the data from another database which it has significant overlap. So it wanted to do it with the One Nation, One Ration food database that exists, and maybe adopt some simple secondary eligibility criteria if it wanted to, and populate the database using Aadhaar as a common identifier. But at this point of time, it cannot do so because sharing of Aadhaar numbers across databases is not permitted by the Aadhaar Act and by the Supreme Court, except if the purposes are originally indicated to the user at the time that you were taking up enrolling for the first time. So this is a major problem that defeats the purpose of Aadhaar to provide ease of access to residents in accessing subsidies. So if citizen centricity is to be central and has to be complementary to savings, then every citizen should have to provide his or her basic demographic and biometric information to the government only once using Aadhaar. So the citizen really should have to provide his data to the government only once using Aadhaar, and Aadhaar can then become the common identifier that is used to migrate the information from one database to the other, especially as in cases like this, where a migrant workers database seems to be the need of the hour during the lockdown and the pandemic. So this, of course, should be only for government welfare schemes, and it should be based on individual consent. But I think there is, if citizen centricity is going to be front and center of how Aadhaar is going to be designed, then I think we need to start thinking about Aadhaar as a single sign-on for government-resident interaction. Second, which is a very important point that Sandip made about fallback options and the use of consent. This is where the Supreme Court judgment in 2018 upholding the constitutionality of Aadhaar is both relevant, while at the same time I feel it's a missed opportunity. So as I said, the paper makes this very important point that the use of Aadhaar should be consent-based with alternate offline options provided. And I think this is critical because exclusion errors, at least those of the biometric mismatch variety, when your biometrics are not matching, are not a consequence of using Aadhaar. And I think this is an important point to note, that if there is a biometric mismatch which leads to exclusion, then that is not a consequence of using Aadhaar. It is a consequence of using Aadhaar exclusively. And I think that's a difference that we need to understand, that if somebody's biometrics don't match, if they are not getting their rations as a result of that, it's because you're not allowing a fallback option. It's not because you're using Aadhaar to begin with. So my point is that as long as Aadhaar usage is voluntary, whether the use is by the government or the use is by a private sector body should not matter. And I think this is where the Supreme Court judgment misses a trick. While it upholds the usage of Aadhaar, even mandatory use of Aadhaar for government welfare schemes, it kind of says that the private sector use of Aadhaar means its commercialization, and commercialization is not going to be permitted. Now, I think the main cleavage cannot be whether that public is good and private is bad. As in, I don't think there is a principle in law that justifies something like this. This is like saying that every private sector body, a hospital that is now vaccinating, is doing it only for monetary reasons. And I think there is a major point here that the main cleavage should be on consensual use vis-a-vis mandatory use. So I think the paper's recommendation that of consensual use with alternate options being provided should be the main determinant of future uses of Aadhaar, including in government welfare schemes like the one Karthik, Paul, and Sandip have studied, not whether it is private sector versus public sector. So if I want to enter the airport tomorrow through biometric Aadhaar-based recognition rather than give my physical card to a security guard, then that should be my choice. It really shouldn't be determined by the Supreme Court on whether this is a permissible use or not. So if someone else wants to go to a security guard, sure, go to a security guard. So I think it should be entirely choice-based, and future uses of Aadhaar, both for welfare programs as well as other private sector uses, should be based on this issue of voluntariness rather than some obscure determination as to whether we think this is important enough for Aadhaar to be used. And this brings me to my third and last point, which is that having looked at Aadhaar through all its phases, as in I started working on Aadhaar in 2013, I think we are now, or we perhaps should be, in what I would say is phase 3 of Aadhaar, which I would call Aadhaar as a service. So phase 1 of Aadhaar, which is when Nandan started thinking about the program, was essentially, as Stuti mentioned, Aadhaar as identity. That was the basic core idea, that it was going to provide an identity. Phase 2, as Arvind is here, as in Arvind coined the JAM Trinity, phase 2 of Aadhaar was Aadhaar as efficient government. How can we deliver benefits and subsidies better? And that was phase 2. And I think in phase 3, which is where we are coming to, given that the Supreme Court is largely behind us and all those battles are behind us, phase 3 of Aadhaar has to be Aadhaar as a service provided by the UIDAI to the public or the private sector, to the state or the center. It's noteworthy that despite the litigation that Aadhaar was mired in, as the paper points out, and this was news to me, that the number of schemes using Aadhaar has increased by a net total of 66. That's great. But if we are to ensure that this growth is not divisive, and the data can further be used to reduce this disagreement that Sandip pointed to, then there are 3 points that I'd like to end with that I think we should consider when we are designing Aadhaar for the future. If some of it can be incorporated in the paper, that's great. So the first is we must adopt a template for consensual use of Aadhaar in a variety of citizen-facing services. The Prime Minister has given a call for ease of living for citizens, and I think ease of living will be hugely furthered if we can ensure that Aadhaar has a template for consensual use or by citizens. By residents, technically, since Aadhaar is not a citizenship card, but that's a separate issue. The second is allow automatic use for all services where, in Sandip's terminology, there is an identity problem. That is, the recipient's identity has to be tested so that she is who she claims to be. For eligibility and disbursal problems, there should be stricter scrutiny. That is Aadhaar really solving the problem? And third, the elephant in the room is the UIDAI, the Unique Identification Authority of India, that administers Aadhaar. In its first phase, that's phase 1, it functioned like a startup. And it had that energy and it was functioning like a startup. In the second phase, because it was mired in all this litigation, it started functioning like a bureaucracy because it had to show that it had kind of grown up and it was ready to take on the challenges. And I think in the third phase, it needs to function as an enabler of an ecosystem rather than its enforcer. And it should focus on security and privacy. It should focus on database management, and it should focus on developing new functionalities. But it should leave the development of use cases and its safeguards to other entities in the ecosystem. In the quote that Stuti gave, the apps that sit on top of Aadhaar, which will use Aadhaar, that will make sure that it really is a service that is provided to citizens and remains true to that promise that Nandan made right at the beginning, rather than become this kind of gigantic bureaucratic elephant that we don't know what we want to do with. So I'm going to end there. I think it's an excellent paper, and it's a real pleasure that I had a chance to comment on it. Thanks, Arvind.
Terrific. Arghya, those were great comments, and also you completed on time. Stuti, I'll give you 2 to 3 minutes, if you don't mind, and because we need to take questions and give the authors a chance to respond, please. Yeah, please, 2 to 3 minutes. Thank you.
Yes, so sorry about that. I realized I didn't open up my PowerPoint again. So the point that where my screen went blank was I was providing some evidence of how bureaucracies in India bureaucracy has been a pejorative word for a long time. And I think the kinds of issues that Arghya was just raising, in fact, and other problems of our times suggest that bureaucracy needs to be reinvented because there is a need for an effective public sector, including for things like having the right systems to manage Aadhaar. So where am I? And then I Share screen. Oh, it is being shared. Okay. Can you all see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Okay. So what? So let me just finish with my 3 slides that I had. One is that the value of theory. What economic theory suggests we need for public sector agencies, precisely because they are charged with pursuing problems of the public good, which markets are either not designed to fully address or fail the way they function. That need is currently not being addressed. And that is the need of our time, to have bureaucracies where the rank and file are deserving of trust. And this is the big question that applies to Aadhaar as a public service as well, and to the bureaucracy that runs Aadhaar. And then on the point that the authors make in their paper, I would be a bit more skeptical. It is not clear that the political principal agent relationship is one where more trust per se is needed. So one could interpret a body of research on the role of ideology and identity in politics, and there's several pieces of papers out there from the US to India to countries in Africa that we reviewed in this policy research report of the World Bank, where there is evidence that where politics is more trusting because the identity or the ideology of the politician is what the voter puts their trust into, the incentives of political leaders to deliver services is weaker. And so it is not clear how to think about the role of trust within the bureaucracy versus in politics. And finally, I just wanted to end again with the first question I began with about Aadhaar and its potential. And I would like to link it to another growing literature of trust, the role of trust in economic markets. Beyond trust within public sector agencies. So Algan and Kahuk have a review paper in the Annual Review of Economics on how trust is empirically and quantifiably important in processes of economic growth. I've tried to apply the insights from this growing literature to the case of Bihar using the survey we did. And I think when it comes to questions of is there much more research that can be done on Aadhaar, I would really urge this policy piece as going well beyond research on beneficiary targeting to really, guiding the research market to examine much larger questions about whether the technology of Aadhaar is helping poor people navigate transaction costs in economic markets more generally. So I'll stop there. Sorry again for the disruption, and thank you for the opportunity to discuss these remarkable issues.
Okay, great. Those were 2 terrific sets of comments, raising a lot of questions, which I hope the authors will respond to. There is one question in the Q&A box about whether the authors could give a sense of the last mile challenge. How easy was it for people to withdraw money using smart cards or Aadhaar-based systems? That was from Sandhya Garg. I'm going to call upon one of the gurus of Indian state capacity, Devesh Kapoor, to ask his question on the paper. Devesh, floor is yours.
Thanks, Arvind. Thanks for a terrific paper and the comments. I just wanted to add one point. There is one other pan-India ID, which is voter IDs. Right, it's a valid government ID. Of course, you only get it if you're above the age of 18. And I thought it might be useful for the authors to look at that ID and the problems of exclusion and inclusion of actually the most long-standing national ID system in India since independence. Now, and why that can't be used as a fallback option, say when there are problems of authentication on Aadhaar, because after all, it is a government ID. And it's pretty universal as far as we are aware. There is an issue that voter IDs are location specific, but now that the PDS is also was sort of location specific, but with the one nation, one ration card scheme, that's likely to change. And also what's interesting is that the ECI has now begun to shift from a paper-based sort of voter ID to an electronic voter ID, which you can download on your phone, etc. I just wanted to bring to the author's attention whether they might want to think about juxtaposing the Aadhaar to the sort of voter ID, and what lessons Aadhaar might learn from the record of the ECI's voter ID. Thank you.
Okay, so we have just about 15 minutes before we hand over. And I know that certainly Sandip, but Karthik also is probably itching to jump in, and Paul as well. So let me transfer pass the floor on to the authors to respond to, both the, Stuti also had some kind of broader questions about, which I thought were very interesting, even if they're slightly kind of beyond the scope of this paper. Those are issues that both Devesh and I have also written about how should you kind of, researchers engage with policy, and the broader questions that she raised. I thought Arghya had a very nice kind of way of talking about the three phases of Aadhaar. And so those comments, the question from the audience and Devesh's question as well. Floor is now yours. To the Trinity, Father, Son, Holy Ghost, whoever is whoever wants to go first, please, floor is yours.
Great, thank you so much, Arvind, and thank you so much, Stuti and Arghya, for the amazing comments. So I'll try and jump in, and I'm sure Karthik will want to at the end as well, to respond. I think these were all really, really helpful. So Stuti, let me start with Stuti's first, go to Arghya, and then respond to the two outstanding questions, and then Karthik and Paul can jump in. So I think, Stuti, you had a really good pushes. I think, you were unsatisfied with some aspects of the paper, and some of these pushes are really good, and I think really fantastic, and we'll take them on board. Others, though, I thought were actually a little bit unfair, so I will push back on those. So I think the things that were completely fair and we will try and do a better job are related to trust. Yes, we sort of brought it up in the end. We haven't dealt with it properly, and I think we need to. We will do that. The other issue that is, I think we could do a better job with, that we hadn't. You brought up, things that Aadhaar could be used for. We could maybe use some theory to predict. So we could talk a little bit about portability, for example, and the benefits of that, and push in that direction. I think that's really useful. That could be useful. On privacy, you were exactly right. Like we had very little to say. I think we should mention it. We were hoping that, that's why we suggested Arghya as a discussant to get that perspective, because we don't really think that that's our forte, really. And I'll come to his comments in just a little bit. So I think those are all really, really useful comments, and I think we can do something about the things that, I don't think there's that much we can do. I mean, I see the clamoring for a broader treatment, but to be honest, a lot of it is just going to be speculative, right? And as economists, we're just so loath to be speculative about, like, okay, here's all the wonderful things that could happen, or here are directions in which things could be pushed. So there, I mean, I don't know, we can go back to the drawing board a little bit, discuss a little bit, and see what else we can say. So I think, and again, to be honest, we can, we'd hope that this would be a bit more of a review article, but there's just so little done that it became narrow. The scope was that, oh, look, let's look at all the different things that have been written about Aadhaar, all these different aspects. But there's so little that's actually been done that's based on real data that we just start getting narrower and narrower. And it felt bad to focus so much time and attention on our own studies, but that's what we ended up having to do kind of as default. Okay, so the things that I think I really push back hard on are I think you'd mentioned outdated, because we don't talk about things like UBI, but you know, our framework of transferring value is literally exactly applicable to UBI, right? So I mean, just because we don't mention it, we are actually, before the pandemic hit, we were working with the governments of multiple states to think about working on UBI type projects, but in terms of the framework, it fits in perfectly. So I would be really strongly push back against that. And the other thing that I think I would push back against is this idea that perhaps we need to be a little bit more self-critical. I mean, being completely honest, we're very happy to be self-critical when needs to be, but it sounded like you came up with the sense that, oh, these problems should have been obvious and we should have advised the government to do something about it before actually evaluating. So I would like to say, first of all, we never force governments to do something they are not planning on doing. In fact, in every single case, the government has already taken a decision on what to do, how they're going to do it, and we beg them to basically say, hey, you know you're going to roll it out place by place, just do this in a randomized fashion, okay? That is our MO, and we're very strict about that. Now, if governments are doing something that is obviously stupid ex ante, we will step in and say something. But again, you have to look back. This is 2016. The State of Aadhaar report has not even been written. DRES et al. Has not even been written. Like, we don't have any of this ex post validation or ideas or knowledge on what is going to happen. The government is pushing because that's the directive that it's gotten. They're going to go ahead and implement as fast as possible. And in fact, like, we were the ones who were like, guys, go slow. Let's do this systematically. Okay, so to that extent, that's what we did. So I think, I mean, if there was something that we could have said at that point to change policy outcomes in a positive way, we would have. But this is really very far from the situation. So that's what I wanted to push back strongly on. In terms of Arghya, you know, it was just, I thought the comments were fantastic. There's nothing I really need to push back on. In fact, I think we're just going to steal a lot of your comments and ideas. The consensual use, we will put that word in there versus mandatory, because I think that actually captures much better what we were trying to say. This idea of the phases that Arvind mentioned, really useful. Think about Aadhaar as a service, and then link that back a little bit to what Stuti was saying about, okay, what else can be done? And it will be a little bit speculative, and it will push us beyond the comfort zone a little bit. And I think that's okay, and we will take those on board. Okay, in terms of the questions, so in terms of the first question is pretty straightforward, the last mile challenge. So in terms of smart cards, so that's a good question, because I think I couldn't go into the details, but what smart cards did was they used these TSPs and CSPs and BCs, you know, all these acronyms, basically business correspondence, to make the payments in cash at the village. So they did that pretty well. And I think that was one of the reasons why transactions costs went down, and you know, things got a lot better for people collecting their payments. And so that problem was solved pretty well. In the PDS case, there was basically, it was just the same. There was just the dealer and who was making the same sort of transactions. In terms of Devesh's question, Devesh, you know, I think it's a really fantastic idea to think about using the voter ID as a fallback. You know, to be honest, I don't I don't know that I don't know to what extent that database has been cleaned up. I will admit that the last time I checked a few years ago, I appeared on the voter rolls 3 times under 3 different spellings of my name. So deduplication of that definitely needs to happen. And I actually haven't lived in that location where my parents live for many, many years now, but I'm still on the voter rolls under 3 different names. I don't know if anybody's voted. If anybody says that I voted for a particular way finds my records, I have not. So clearly that database has its problems, but as you say, I think it maybe the problems are not of exclusion there, but maybe the problems are of inclusion. So perhaps it can be maybe for solving the problem of exclusion by Aadhaar, perhaps that can be a very, very useful fallback. And I think it's really interesting. We'll try and dig up a little bit on what we can say about whether that's been cleaned up, to what extent that might serve as a useful fallback or not.
So I think, so super quickly, thanks for all the comments. I think, Stuti, as with any of these papers, right, there's a challenge of defining scope, right? This is such an enormous issue that we, in the end, just kind of had to go where the evidence was, right? So in that sense, but I think one important point you raise is that maybe what we should do is end with saying, here are all of these other big open questions on Aadhaar, on which, said guide future research, right, where we can offer pointers to. But if we took it all, and then it's very unsatisfying to say all of this matters, but by the way, we have nothing to say because there's very little data, right? So I think that was the tension we were straddling. I think on trust, we were trying to make a much narrower point, right? I think everything you say, I agree with. See, we were making a much narrower point, which is that, and I think Arghya picked up on this, right? Which is that the debate is just so polarized because the activists and the proponents and opponents are just talking past each other, right? I mean, and so the simple point we were making is that when you have such a wide distribution of outcomes, you can cherry pick whatever story you want and tell whatever narrative you want, right? I mean, and the two narratives are talking past each other because people on the ground who observe exclusion are just highlighting that. People on the government side who see the reduction in outlay are highlighting that and saying, listen, we are getting this big reduction in leakage. So how do you narrow that kind of disagreement and how do you build trust? So that was the narrow point we were making. I mean, there's obviously a much, much broader point about trust. And, and maybe, again, it's probably beyond the scope of the paper, but just wanted to explain kind of, where that was coming from. So I think I just want to make one overall point on this research agenda over 10 years. And end actually with a question for Arghya, because your comments were fantastic, and a question on the way forward. So the overall comment I want to make on the research agenda is how much we have learned in this process and how much our own priors have changed, right? I mean, and so if you looked at what was happening in AP in the beginning, that we were actually trying to get them to push the rollout faster, right? I mean, so coming back to Stuti's point, we didn't change policy, we didn't change design, we didn't do any of that, right? All we were doing was government is doing this anyway, let's go get the measurement and evaluation done. But the interesting thing there is the political pushback was coming from saying that, no, let's do this slowly because we don't want anybody excluded, right? So, which is why it's easy in retrospect to criticize what was happening in Jharkhand and saying, oh, government should have done slowly. But what the government was doing there was what even we thought should have been done in AP, see, because we thought that if you go slowly, the leakage will still continue, because you're not really shutting down the margins on which the leakage happens. And so you need to get this out, because unless you make this mandatory, people will still find, all the loopholes will still be there, right? So that was our own prior. And so it's only through the lived experience of kind of seeing this play out in the field that we kind of have realized that the focus on fiscal savings may be a bit of a mistake, tactical mistake, right? Because if you focus on the beneficiary experience, you will get the long-term adoption and the fiscal savings will follow. So I think that's just been an important change in our own thinking based on all of the work that's happened. I think my final question to Arghya, which is, I think all your comments were fantastic. But my question is, how much of this kind of cul-de-sac that we're in is a legacy of this kind of perhaps too clever by half introduction of Aadhaar as a money bill, right? So if because of the fact, my read of the judgment is that the use was restricted to these cases of government transfer programs, because to be justified as a money bill, there had to be a direct fiscal, to or from the citizen. Now, when you want to move beyond that to Aadhaar as a service, and I think do all of these broader enabling things in the ecosystem, is this going to require essentially going back to the drawing board on the legislation and redoing this, or what is possible? So that's, I'm just really curious about that.
I'll just do this very quickly, Arvind, if that's
yeah,
okay.
yeah, please, Arghya, please respond. Yeah.
Just in a minute. I think, Karthik, you're on to something there, that I think the entire orientation of Aadhaar from an identity to the fact that it has to be something that is the backbone for delivery of services changed around that time when it was necessary to pass Aadhaar. And I think it was done, as Arvind was there, as he knows more about this than I do. But the fact is, I think there was a genuine belief that Aadhaar, in order to deliver benefits and welfare, as in that would be its most important and significant use case. And I think it was prompted by that belief that that the decision was taken, that this is how we are going to go ahead and do it, number one. Number two is that I don't think we are in this privacy cul-de-sac because of the money bill. I think there are some serious issues in relation to privacy which have been raised, and rightly so. And I think Aadhaar today is better for it, that these issues have been raised and continuously flagged. And I think with the Supreme Court having settled that matter in 2018, at least the privacy issues, I think we are out of that cul-de-sac. And I think, and this paper, and which is why I really commend it, is actually taking us back to the issues that we should have been discussing all along. And now that we have exited the cul-de-sac, let's go back and discuss those issues. So I think, second, I think the privacy issue is kind of on the back burner. And I think Aadhaar is better for it because it has now taken into account all these into its architecture. And number three, and I'm going to end with this, which is that what does the future hold, particularly legally? As in, I think there is a need for a Aadhaar 2.0 legislation. If we were going to design it, and we have the experience of the last 5 years in terms of what's worked, what's not, I think we do need to have some of these things that you said, that we need consensual use, we need fallback options, we need to have private sector use, we need to have privacy protections. We need that all in an Aadhaar 2.0 legislation, which can become a firmer backbone now that we all know, with the blessing of the Supreme Court, that Aadhaar is here to stay.
Great. I think on that note, let's all, in whatever virtual way we can, give a big round of applause to the authors, Sandip, Karthik, and Paul, and the two terrific discussants. Also, please, a request to the authors, there are questions in the Q&A box. If you don't mind, if you could respond to those, whatever, bilaterally or whatever. A great session. Thank you all very much. And